The bass thumped through the walls, reverberating in my chest as I stood at the entrance of the nightclub. Neon lights flickered, casting a chaotic mix of colors on the crowd inside. This wasn't my usual scene, but something had drawn me here tonight, a gut feeling I couldn't shake. The air was thick with sweat, perfume, and the unmistakable scent of alcohol. I took a deep breath and pushed through the crowd, my mind buzzing with thoughts of my wife, Sarah. She had been acting distant lately, brushing off my concerns with forced smiles and vague excuses. Something wasn't right, and I needed to find out what it was. As I navigated through the throngs of people, I caught glimpses of dancers, their bodies moving in sync with the pounding rhythm. It was a world far removed from the quiet life Sarah and I had built together. The noise, the lights, the chaos, it all seemed surreal. But tonight, I wasn't here for the music or the drinks. I was here to chase down a suspicion that had been gnawing at me for weeks. I spotted the bar in the distance, its neon sign flickering like a dying firefly. Making my way towards it, I passed by a group of men, their laughter loud and raucous. Something about them caught my eye, a familiarity in their faces that I couldn't quite place. But before I could dwell on it, I felt a sharp tug on my arm. I turned around to see a man, his face half hidden in shadow, sneering at me. "Got some nerve coming here alone, pal," he muttered, his breath reeking of whiskey. "This ain't your kind of place." Before I could respond, another man appeared behind him, shoving me hard against the bar. The edge of the counter dug into my back, and I winced in pain. My hands instinctively reached for my wallet, but it was too late. In a blur of movement, they had it, along with every dollar I had on me. "Thanks for the donation," one of them sneered as they melted back into the crowd. I was left standing there, heart pounding, more angry than afraid. But I couldn't focus on the loss of my money right now. I had a feeling that the real reason I was here was far worse than a simple robbery. Shaking off the encounter, I headed towards the VIP section. I'd overheard some patrons talking about a private party going on upstairs, and something told me that's where I needed to be. It wasn't easy getting past the bouncer, but a small lie about meeting my wife upstairs did the trick. I climbed the narrow staircase, the sounds of the club fading into the background as I reached the top. The atmosphere was different here, more intimate, with dim lighting and plush seating. A large glass window overlooked the dance floor below, giving the VIPs a view of the chaos beneath them. I scanned the room, searching for any sign of Sarah. My heart raced as my eyes landed on a group of people huddled near the back, their faces obscured by the low light. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There, in the midst of it all, was Sarah. Her back was turned to me, but I recognized her immediately, her long, dark hair cascading down her back, the dress she'd bought just a week ago for a girls' night out. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hand resting on the shoulder of a man I didn't recognize. I felt a pang of jealousy, but it was quickly replaced by something far worse. As I watched, the man leaned in, whispering something in her ear. She responded with a coy smile, the kind that used to be reserved just for me. My stomach churned as I realized what was happening. It wasn't just one man. Two others were there, each one taking turns to touch her, to pull her close. And she was letting them, no, she was encouraging it. I felt sick. My legs turned to lead as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I needed to get out of there, to escape the nightmare unfolding before my eyes. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a CCTV camera mounted in the corner, its lens pointed directly at the group. Desperation took over. I made my way back down to the main floor, trying to keep my composure as I approached the bar. I needed to see the footage, needed to know that what I had just witnessed was real. My head was spinning, my vision blurring with anger and disbelief. When I reached the bar, I flagged down the bartender and told him my story, claiming I'd lost something valuable upstairs. It took some convincing, but eventually, he led me to the security room, a small, cramped space filled with monitors. The bouncer from earlier gave me a skeptical look as I entered, but I didn't care. I had to see it for myself. The bartender pulled up the footage, fast-forwarding to the moment I'd seen upstairs. I held my breath as the screen flickered to life, showing the VIP section from a different angle. There she was, my wife, Sarah, in the arms of three strangers. They were taking turns with her, each one more brazen than the last. And she was lost in it, her body moving with theirs as if in a trance. I watched in horror as the scene played out before me. There was no mistaking it, no denying what I was seeing. This wasn't just a moment of weakness, a drunken mistake. This was something darker, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for who knows how long. My mind raced as I tried to process it all. Why hadn't she told me she was going out? Why had she lied? And more importantly, how could she do this to me, to us? The betrayal cut deep, but it wasn't just the act itself that hurt. It was the realization that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I loved, was capable of something like this. As the footage ended, I felt a cold, steely resolve take hold. There was no going back from this. Sarah had made her choice, and now I had to make mine. The marriage was over, there was no doubt about that. But I couldn't just walk away, not after what I'd seen. She needed to understand the gravity of what she'd done. And I would make sure she paid for it, one way or another. I left the nightclub that night with a plan forming in my mind. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Sarah had destroyed our life together, and now I would destroy hers. The thought gave me a twisted sense of satisfaction, a dark thrill that pushed back the pain. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a throbbing headache and a heart weighed down by the events of the previous night. My mind raced through the scenes I had witnessed, Sarah's betrayal, the men surrounding her, the look of pure ecstasy on her face. It felt like a bad dream, but the ache in my chest reminded me it was all too real. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. How could this happen? How could the woman I had spent years loving and building a life with do something so vile? But there was no time to dwell on the why right now. I needed to act. I couldn't let her get away with this. I had to protect myself, my future, everything I had worked so hard to build. She had already shattered my trust, but I wasn't going to let her ruin my life. I dragged myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the hot water scald my skin. It felt like I was washing away the remnants of my old life, shedding the naivety that had blinded me to Sarah's deceit. I had always been the trusting husband, the one who believed in second chances, but not anymore. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I was determined to make her pay for it. Once I was dressed, I headed straight to my lawyer's office. The thought of divorce had never crossed my mind before, but now it was the only option. I couldn't stay married to someone who could betray me so completely, and I certainly couldn't let her think she could walk away from this unscathed. When I arrived at the law firm, I felt a sense of resolve wash over me. The receptionist greeted me with a polite smile, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I told her I needed to see someone immediately, my situation was urgent. She must have sensed the gravity in my voice because within minutes, I was sitting in a plush office across from a sharp-looking attorney named Laura Winslow. Laura was all business. After a brief introduction, I laid out everything, Sarah's sudden change in behavior, the footage from the nightclub, and my decision to end the marriage. She listened intently, her expression unreadable, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. "This is a serious situation, Tom," she said after I finished. "If what you're telling me is true, you have every right to pursue a divorce on grounds of infidelity. However, you need to be prepared. Cases like this can get messy, especially when emotions are running high. Are you ready for that?" I nodded, my resolve hardening. I don't care how messy it gets. She needs to pay for what she's done. Laura gave a curt nod, pulling out a legal pad and pen. "All right. We'll start by gathering evidence. You mentioned security footage, that will be crucial. Do you have access to it?" "Yes," I replied, my mind flashing back to the small, dingy room in the nightclub. "I can get it." "Good. We'll need to obtain a copy and make sure it's secure. We'll also need to gather any other evidence, text messages, emails, anything that shows a pattern of behavior. The more we have, the stronger our case will be. As Laura continued outlining the steps, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. This was what I needed, a plan, a way to fight back. I couldn't control what Sarah had done, but I could control how I responded. I could take away everything she had, just like she had taken everything from me. When the meeting was over, I left the office feeling a strange mix of emotions. The anger and hurt were still there, but now they were tempered by a cold, calculating determination. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. I was going to be the one who came out on top. The first step was getting the footage. I returned to the nightclub that evening, my heart pounding as I walked through the doors. The place was quieter than the night before, the energy subdued in the early evening hours. I approached the same bartender who had helped me before, explaining that I needed a copy of the footage for personal reasons. After some back and forth, and a bit of cash, he agreed to make a copy for me. As I waited, I replayed the scene in my mind, the images of Sarah and those men etched into my memory. I couldn't understand how she could do it, how she could betray me in such a public, humiliating way. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that understanding wasn't necessary. What mattered now was making sure she didn't get away with it. The bartender returned with a flash drive, his face a mix of curiosity and pity. I pocketed it without a word, leaving the club as quickly as I could. I didn't want to spend another second in that place, not after what I had seen. Back in my car, I stared at the flash drive in my hand, knowing that what it contained would change everything. I felt a sick sense of satisfaction, knowing I had the power to destroy Sarah's life, just as she had destroyed mine. This was my weapon, and I was going to use it. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge. I imagined the look on Sarah's face when she realized I knew, when she saw that there was no way out. I wanted her to feel the same fear, the same helplessness that I had felt watching that footage. But it wasn't just about making her pay. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. When I got home, Sarah was already there, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine. She looked up as I walked in, her face lighting up with a smile that now felt like a lie. "Hey, how was your day?" she asked, her tone casual, as if everything was normal. I felt a wave of disgust wash over me. How could she sit there, so calm, so composed, knowing what she had done? But I forced myself to keep it together. I couldn't let her see how much I knew, how much this had already affected me. "It was fine," I replied, my voice cold and distant. "Just had a few things to take care of." She didn't seem to notice the change in my tone, taking a sip of her wine as she turned back to the TV. "I was thinking we could go out this weekend," she said, her voice filled with a false sense of cheerfulness. "Maybe take a drive up to the mountains?" The suggestion made my stomach turn. The idea of pretending everything was fine, of playing along with her charade, was more than I could handle. But I knew I needed to bide my time. This wasn't the moment to confront her, not yet. "Maybe," I said, forcing a smile. "Let's see how the week goes." She smiled back, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. It took everything in me to stay calm, to play the role of the unsuspecting husband. But inside, I was seething, my mind focused on one thing, revenge. As the night wore on, I found myself watching her every move, searching for any sign of guilt, any hint that she knew what I had discovered. But there was nothing, just the same familiar routine we had followed for years. It was infuriating, knowing that she could hide so much behind that mask of normalcy. But her time would come. I would make sure of that. And when it did, there would be no escaping the consequences. The days that followed felt like a cruel game of cat and mouse. I kept the flash drive hidden, knowing that I would need the perfect moment to spring it on Sarah. But as the tension between us simmered, I realized that simply waiting wasn't enough. I had to shake things up, push her out of her comfort zone, and force her to reveal the cracks in her facade. Sarah, oblivious to the storm brewing within me, continued her life as if nothing had changed. Her smiles, her laughter, they all felt like daggers, each one slicing deeper into the wound she had inflicted. I knew I couldn't hold on much longer without confronting her, but I also knew that the moment had to be perfect. I needed her to be off balance, vulnerable, and unprepared. That moment came sooner than expected. It was a Friday evening, and Sarah was getting ready for what she described as another girls' night out. My blood boiled at the thought of her slipping back into that world, but I kept my expression neutral. She had told me she'd be meeting up with her friends at a new bar downtown, but something in her voice seemed off, too rehearsed, too eager. As she prepared to leave, I casually mentioned that I had planned a surprise for her over the weekend. "You've been working so hard, and I thought we could use some time to unwind together," I said, watching her reaction closely. Her eyes flickered with something, fear? Guilt, before she quickly masked it with a smile. "That sounds wonderful," she replied, her voice a bit too bright. "I'll be home early tonight, and we can talk about it then." I nodded, letting her believe that I was satisfied with her response. But inside, I knew that her promise of an early return was a lie. And I had no intention of waiting for her to break it. After she left, I grabbed my jacket and followed her out, keeping a safe distance as she drove into the city. I had no clear plan, just an overwhelming need to see where she was going, to confirm my suspicions. The thought of her slipping into another man's arms, of repeating the betrayal I had already witnessed, was more than I could bear. As she pulled into the parking lot of a small, upscale hotel, my heart began to race. This wasn't the bar she had mentioned. This was something else entirely. I parked a few spaces away, my hands trembling as I watched her step out of the car and head inside, her heels clicking against the pavement. For a moment, I considered confronting her right there, demanding answers, forcing her to explain herself. But something held me back. The need to know, to see it with my own eyes, was stronger than the impulse to react. I needed proof, something undeniable that would shatter whatever lies she planned to spin. I waited a few minutes before following her in, the lobby empty except for the concierge who barely glanced up as I walked by. The elevator doors were closing just as I entered, and I caught a glimpse of Sarah's back as she disappeared inside. I waited for the next elevator, my mind racing with a mix of fear, anger, and determination. When I reached the floor she had gone to, I stepped out cautiously, scanning the hallway for any sign of her. My heart pounded as I approached a door at the far end of the corridor, slightly ajar. The sound of muffled voices reached my ears, a man's deep voice, followed by Sarah's unmistakable laugh. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The laughter was light, almost carefree, a stark contrast to the dark thoughts swirling in my mind. I couldn't believe it was happening again, that she had the audacity to lie to my face and then go off to meet someone else. But what I heard next made my blood run cold. "Are you sure he won't find out?" the man asked, his voice low and conspiratorial. Sarah's response was barely above a whisper, but I caught every word. "He's too trusting," she said with a small, bitter laugh. "Besides, if he ever did find out, it wouldn't matter. He's too weak to do anything about it." Weak! The word echoed in my mind, cutting deeper than any physical wound could. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body tensing with the urge to burst through that door and confront them. But I held back, knowing that I needed more than just their words. I needed to see it, to have undeniable proof that would leave no room for her to talk her way out of this. Steeling myself, I pulled out my phone and turned on the camera, creeping closer to the door. I didn't dare push it open, but the angle was just enough to catch a glimpse of the room inside. My heart hammered in my chest as I focused the lens on the bed. There she was, my wife, Sarah, lying on the bed with the same man I had seen her with in the nightclub footage. His hands were all over her, and she responded to his touch with a passion that I hadn't seen in years. They were laughing, whispering things I couldn't hear, completely wrapped up in each other. The sight of them together, so intimate and carefree, was a knife to the gut. I wanted to scream, to throw the door open and rip them apart, but I forced myself to stay still. The footage I was capturing would be more powerful than any confrontation I could stage in that moment. This was the proof I needed, not just for the divorce, but for the revenge I was planning. I recorded for what felt like an eternity, every second driving the knife deeper into my heart. But even as the pain consumed me, I felt a dark satisfaction knowing that their betrayal was being documented, that their lies would soon be exposed to the world. When I had enough, I backed away from the door and slipped down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. I could still hear their laughter echoing in my mind, mingling with Sarah's cruel words. Weak. That's what she thought of me. But she had no idea what I was capable of when pushed to the edge. I made it back to my car, my hands shaking as I clutched the steering wheel. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced before, raw, consuming, and dangerous. I knew then that simply divorcing her wouldn't be enough. She needed to suffer, to feel the same pain and humiliation she had inflicted on me. The plan was taking shape in my mind, darker and more twisted with each passing second. I would destroy her, slowly, methodically, and completely. She had underestimated me, but she would soon learn just how wrong she was. As I drove home, my thoughts were consumed by what I would do next. The footage would be my weapon, but there were other ways to make her pay, to ruin her life piece by piece. The thought filled me with a sense of power, a dark thrill that made the pain a little easier to bear. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had a plan. I would play the role of the dutiful husband a little longer, keeping her in the dark while I set the stage for her downfall. I would gather every piece of evidence, every bit of dirt I could find, and when the time was right, I would unleash it all. There would be no escape, no mercy. And when it was all over, she would be left with nothing. As I walked into the house, I was greeted by the sight of Sarah, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had happened. The sight of her, so calm and composed, sent a fresh wave of anger through me. But I swallowed it down, forcing a smile as I approached her. "How was your night?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She looked up at me with that same fake smile, the one I had grown to despise. "It was good," she replied, her tone light. "We just had a few drinks and caught up on gossip. Nothing too exciting." I nodded, the bile rising in my throat. "Sounds nice," I said, leaning down to kiss her on the cheek. The gesture made my skin crawl, but I needed to keep up the act a little longer. "Let's get some sleep," I suggested, trying to keep the venom out of my voice. "We've got a big weekend ahead of us." She agreed, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit her life. As she headed to bed, I stayed behind in the living room, watching her go with a cold, calculating gaze. The clock was ticking, and soon enough, her world would come crashing down. I would make sure of it. And when it did, she would wish she had never crossed me. The weekend unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play, but I could see through the act. Sarah's smiles, her laughter, they were all too perfect, too polished. The more she tried to convince me that everything was normal, the more certain I became that she was hiding something. It wasn't just the lies that were eating at me, it was the sheer audacity of her pretending that nothing had changed. On Sunday morning, she suggested we take a drive to the mountains. It used to be our thing, a way to escape the noise of our lives and reconnect with each other. But today, it felt different, forced, like she was trying too hard to recreate something that was already broken. As we drove through the winding roads, the landscape around us breathtakingly beautiful, my mind was a storm of thoughts and emotions. I kept glancing over at her, trying to read her expression, to see if there was any hint of guilt or regret. But she was good, too good. She played the role of the loving wife flawlessly, as if nothing had changed between us. But I knew better. I could see the cracks in her mask, the little hesitations in her responses, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She was hiding something, and I was determined to find out what it was. We reached our favorite spot, a secluded area overlooking a valley that seemed to stretch on forever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the landscape. It should have been a moment of peace, a chance to reconnect. But all I felt was a cold emptiness inside. We sat down on a large rock, the silence between us growing heavier by the minute. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I knew I couldn't keep pretending much longer. The time had come to confront her. Sarah, I began, my voice barely more than a whisper. There's something I need to ask you. She turned to me, her smile faltering slightly. What is it? She asked, her tone cautious, as if she sensed what was coming. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I've noticed you've been distant lately, I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. You've been going out more, and it feels like you're pulling away from me. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she quickly masked it. Tom, I've told you, I'm just stressed from work, she said, her voice a little too bright. You're overthinking this. We're fine. Are we? I pressed, not letting her off the hook. Because it doesn't feel like we are. It feels like there's something you're not telling me. She stared at me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of doubt. For a moment, I thought she might confess, might finally tell me the truth. But then she shook her head, a forced laugh escaping her lips. Tom, you're being paranoid, she said, trying to brush off my concerns. There's nothing going on. I swear. But I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. She was scared that I was getting too close to the truth. I don't believe you, I said, my voice steady but cold. I've seen the way you look at me, like you're hiding something. I need to know, Sarah. I need to know what's really going on. Her smile faded, and for the first time, I saw a crack in her mask. She looked away, biting her lip, as if trying to hold back the truth. Tom, I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered, her voice trembling. I want you to tell me the truth, I said, my frustration boiling over. I want you to be honest with me for once. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm not lying to you, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. You're imagining things, Tom. You have to trust me. The word trust felt like a knife twisting in my gut. How could she talk about trust when she had shattered mine so completely? The anger I had been holding back surged forward, and I could feel the walls closing in around me. Trust you? I repeated, my voice rising. How can I trust you when you've been lying to me all along? Her face went pale, and she stared at me, her eyes wide with shock. Tom, I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but there was a tremor in her voice. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone. My hand shook as I opened the video file, the image of her with that man flashing across the screen. This, I said, holding it up for her to see. This is what I'm talking about. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the screen, the color draining from her face. Tom, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I can explain. Explain? I snapped, my anger boiling over. There's nothing to explain, Sarah. I saw everything. You betrayed me, and now you're trying to lie your way out of it? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, her body trembling. Tom, please, she begged, her voice breaking. It was a mistake, a stupid, horrible mistake. I didn't mean to hurt you. I felt a cold, hollow laugh escape my lips. A mistake? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You didn't mean to hurt me? You knew exactly what you were doing, Sarah. You knew, and you did it anyway. She collapsed to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of her cries. I watched her, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness inside. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted with my life, was gone. In her place was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, someone I couldn't forgive. Please, Tom, she whispered, her voice broken. Please don't leave me. We can fix this. I'll do anything. But her words rang hollow in my ears. The damage was done, and there was no going back. It's too late, I said, my voice cold and final. We're done, Sarah. There's no fixing this. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, desperate for forgiveness that I could never give. "Please," she sobbed, reaching out for me. "Don't do this. I love you." "Love?" I spat, my voice filled with bitterness. "You don't know the meaning of the word. If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have destroyed us." She crumpled to the ground, her sobs growing louder, more desperate. But I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't bear to watch her fall apart, knowing that she had brought this on herself. "I'm filing for divorce tomorrow," I said, my voice void of emotion. "This is the end, Sarah. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her behind, the sound of her sobs echoing in my ears. The drive home was a blur, my mind numb, my heart shattered. I had ended it, but there was no relief, no satisfaction, only a deep, hollow emptiness. As I pulled into the driveway, I realized that the confrontation hadn't brought me the closure I had hoped for. It had only deepened the wound, made the betrayal more real, more painful. But there was no turning back now. The marriage was over, and the woman I had once loved was gone. But even as the darkness closed in around me, I felt a flicker of resolve. The divorce was just the beginning. I had to rebuild my life, reclaim my dignity, my sense of self. And I would start by making sure that Sarah felt the full weight of what she had done. She had underestimated me, but she would soon learn just how wrong she was. The storm was coming, and this time, I wouldn't be the one left in ruins. The weekend in the mountains was a smokescreen, a false calm before the inevitable storm. As I drove back home, the sun dipping below the horizon, I felt an eerie stillness inside me. It wasn't the emptiness I had felt before, it was something more precise, more focused. A clarity that comes only after all illusions have been shattered. Sarah's sobs echoed in my mind as I left her on that rock, alone in the fading light. She had begged for forgiveness, pleaded for another chance, but I knew there was nothing left to salvage. Her words were just noise now, meaningless against the cold, hard reality of what she had done. When we arrived home, the house felt different, almost foreign. The space we had shared for so many years, filled with memories both good and bad, now felt like a stranger's home. I could sense Sarah's unease as she followed me inside, her steps hesitant, as if she were walking on thin ice. She knew something had changed, that the lie she had been living was unraveling faster than she could mend it. That night, as she slept beside me, her breathing shallow and fitful, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one sharpening the edges of my resolve. The footage on my phone wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon. And I was ready to use it. Morning came, bringing with it a strange sense of finality. I got up early, leaving Sarah still asleep, and made my way to the kitchen. As I brewed a pot of coffee, the plan that had been forming in my mind took on a life of its own. This wasn't just about ending our marriage. It was about making her understand the full weight of her betrayal, about ensuring she felt the same pain and humiliation that she had inflicted on me. When Sarah finally emerged, her eyes puffy from a night of crying, I was already seated at the table, a cup of coffee in hand. She hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether to approach. I watched her, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. "Morning," she finally said, her voice tentative. "Morning," I replied, my tone neutral. I took a sip of my coffee, watching her over the rim of the cup. "We need to talk." She winced at my words, but nodded, taking a seat across from me. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her robe, a nervous habit I had never seen before. "Tom, Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Just listen." Her mouth snapped shut, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She was bracing herself, waiting for the hammer to fall. "I've thought a lot about what happened," I began, my voice calm, measured. "And I've come to a decision." She swallowed hard, her eyes never leaving mine. "Tom, please, just let me explain." "There's nothing left to explain, Sarah," I said, cutting her off again. "I know what you did. I know who you've become. And I can't live with that." Her face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, Tom. I never meant for any of this to happen." "Maybe you didn't," I said, my tone still cold. "But it did happen. And now we both have to deal with the consequences." She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over mine, but I pulled away before she could touch me. The hurt in her eyes was palpable, but I forced myself to stay strong, to remember what she had done. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, the words falling like stones between us. "But before I do, there's something you need to see." I pulled out my phone, the screen already displaying the video I had recorded at the hotel. Her eyes widened as she recognized the scene, and she recoiled as if the device itself had burned her. "Tom, please," she pleaded, her voice desperate. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes, I swear." I shook my head, the cold resolve in my chest hardening further. "There's no fixing this, Sarah. I just want you to see the truth, to understand what you've done." With that, I pressed play, setting the phone on the table between us. The video began to play, the sound of her laughter, her voice, filling the room. She watched in horror as the scene unfolded, her face going from pale to ashen. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a sob, but I didn't look away. I wanted her to see it all, to feel every second of the betrayal she had wrought. When the video ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Sarah sat there, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. I felt a flicker of something, pity, perhaps, but I pushed it aside. This was necessary. She needed to see the truth in all its ugliness. "Now you understand," I said quietly, my voice devoid of emotion. "This is who you are, Sarah. This is what you've done." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears, her eyes hollow with guilt and despair. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I replied, my tone as cold as the coffee in my cup. "And now you have to live with it." She nodded, her head hanging low, defeated. I could see the fight draining out of her, the realization that there was no way back from this. The marriage was over, and so was the life we had built together. I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "I'll pack my things and be out by the end of the day," I said, my voice flat. "The lawyer will be in touch." As I turned to leave, I heard her whisper something, so faint, I almost missed it. "I love you, Tom." I paused, the words hanging in the air like a ghost. But they meant nothing to me now. They were just echoes of a life that no longer existed. Without a word, I walked out of the kitchen, out of the house that had once been our home. I felt nothing as I crossed the threshold, no sadness, no regret. Just a cold, steely resolve to move forward, to rebuild my life from the ashes of what Sarah had destroyed. I had the evidence I needed, the proof of her betrayal. But more than that, I had the knowledge that I had done everything I could to confront her with the truth. She would have to live with the consequences of her actions, and I would have to find a way to live with the scars they had left behind. As I loaded the last of my things into the car, I took one last look at the house. It no longer felt like home, just a shell of what it used to be. I turned away, started the engine, and drove off, leaving it all behind. The future was uncertain, and the path ahead was dark. But I knew one thing for sure, I would survive this. I would come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And as for Sarah, she would have to live with the knowledge that she had lost everything that truly mattered. The road stretched out before me, winding through the landscape like a promise of something new, something better. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to find out. This was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was ready to write it on my own terms. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings with lawyers, and packing up my life. The house that Sarah and I had shared became a maze of memories I couldn't escape fast enough. Each room held echoes of a life that now felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I moved through it with a numb determination, boxing up the remnants of our marriage with the same cold efficiency I had used to dismantle it. Sarah stayed out of my way, a shadow in the house, barely speaking except for the occasional plea for forgiveness. But there was nothing left to say. The distance between us was more than physical, it was a chasm that no apology could bridge. We were living as strangers under the same roof, waiting for the final blow to fall. On the day the divorce papers were finalized, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, this chapter of my life was closing, and I could finally begin to move on. But there was also a deep, gnawing sadness that I couldn't quite shake. This wasn't how I had imagined my life turning out. We had started with so much hope, so many dreams for the future. And now, all that was left was a stack of legal documents and a lot of broken promises. That evening, I stood in the empty living room, the last box at my feet, and looked around one final time. The walls that had once echoed with laughter and love were silent now, the life we had built together packed away in cardboard and tape. I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all, the years spent together, the memories both good and bad. It was over, and there was no going back. I was about to leave when I heard Sarah's footsteps behind me. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, looking small and lost, her eyes red from crying. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak, then finally stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Tom," she began, her voice so soft I could barely hear her. I just wanted to say goodbye. I know I've lost the right to ask for anything from you, but could we talk? Just for a minute?" I considered her request, feeling a pang of something, regret, maybe. But it was too late for regrets. "There's nothing left to say, Sarah," I replied, keeping my tone gentle but firm. "We both know how this ends." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I know," she whispered. "But I can't let you leave without telling you how sorry I am. I ruined everything, and I have to live with that. But you deserve to hear it from me, face to face." I sighed, feeling the last of my anger ebb away. What was the point in holding on to it now? The damage was done, and the person standing before me wasn't the same woman who had betrayed me. She was broken, just like I was, and maybe that was punishment enough. "All right," I said, nodding for her to continue. She took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had begun to fall. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I can ever forgive myself. But I need you to know that I never meant for it to get this far. It started as something stupid, something I didn't even think through. I thought I could control it, that it wouldn't mean anything, but I was wrong. I was so wrong." Her voice cracked, and she paused, collecting herself before continuing. "I don't know why I did it, Tom. Maybe it was boredom, maybe it was insecurity. I don't even know anymore. But I know that it was the biggest mistake of my life. And I lost the best thing that ever happened to me because of it." I listened in silence, letting her words wash over me. There was a time when those words might have mattered, might have changed something. But that time was long gone. Still, I could see that she was sincere, that she was carrying the weight of her actions as heavily as I was. "I'm sorry too, Sarah," I said finally. "I'm sorry it ended this way. I loved you once, more than anything. But we can't go back. All we can do now is move forward." She nodded, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. "I know. I just hope you find happiness again. You deserve that, Tom. More than anyone." I didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch between us. Then, I took a deep breath and said, "You too, Sarah. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for." We stood there for a moment longer, two people who had once shared everything, now standing on opposite sides of a divide that could never be crossed. Finally, I picked up the last box and headed for the door, feeling her gaze on my back as I left. The drive to my new apartment was quiet, the city lights blurring past as I navigated through the streets. I thought about the future, about the life I would build for myself, free from the shadows of the past. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew I would get there. One step at a time. When I arrived, I carried the box inside and set it down in the middle of the empty living room. The space was small, barely furnished, but it was mine, a blank slate, a fresh start. I looked around, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. For the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe. The weight of the past was still there, but it was lighter now, more manageable. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain: I was ready for it. I sat down on the floor, leaning back against the wall, and closed my eyes. The night was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city outside. And in that quiet, I let myself feel the full weight of everything that had happened, the pain, the loss, the betrayal. But I also felt something else, something that had been missing for a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, just a flicker of light in the darkness. But it was enough. Enough to remind me that life goes on, that there's always a way forward, even after the worst has happened. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again, this time with a sense of purpose. The past was behind me, and the future was waiting. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to face it. With a deep breath, I stood up, ready to start this new chapter of my life. One step at a time, one day at a time. I would rebuild, I would recover, and I would find happiness again. Because in the end, that's all we can do. And I was ready.